Hi, this is Reverend Ted, a historian for the Episcopal Diocese of Texas. I congratulate Joe on his new step in his journey as a postulant of the diocese. Joe, it is important for you to understand that the story of the founding of the Church of England on American soil. It was not the establishment of a new denomination. It was the transplantation of an already existing English church into a new land. The Church of England itself had emerged from the English Reformation of the 16th century. By the time English settlers began establishing colonies in North America, the Church of England already possessed its own identity: bishops, priests, and deacons, the Book of Common Prayer, the sacraments, the historic creeds, and a form of Christianity that carried both Catholic and Reformed characteristics. When English settlers crossed the Atlantic, therefore, they did not leave their religion behind. They brought their church with them. There is an earlier Anglican episode that deserves mention. In 1579, during the voyage of Sir Francis Drake, his chaplain, the Reverend Francis Fletcher, conducted Christian worship on the Pacific coast of North America, probably somewhere near what is now Northern California. This is remembered as the earliest recorded Anglican worship associated with English exploration in North America. But it did not establish a permanent congregation. Drake and his crew eventually left, and no lasting English settlement remained. The permanent history of the Church of England in what would become the United States began later, on the Atlantic coast. That permanent beginning came with Jamestown. In December 1606, 3 ships left England under the sponsorship of the Virginia Company of London. They were the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. The expedition crossed the Atlantic and reached the Chesapeake region in the spring of 1607. Eventually, the settlers established Jamestown along the James River in Virginia. Jamestown became the first permanent English settlement in North America. And with those settlers came the Church of England. Among the members of the expedition was the Reverend Robert Hunt, an ordained priest of the Church of England. He served as chaplain to the settlers. Robert Hunt is therefore an important figure for Episcopalians studying their American roots. He reminds us that the Anglican presence in America began not first with church buildings, diocesan offices, bishops, or conventions. It began with ministry. It began with prayer. It began with pastoral care. It began with Christian worship in the middle of uncertainty. On April 29, 1607, after the settlers arrived at Cape Henry, Hunt led them in prayer and thanksgiving near a cross they had erected. Later, after they established Jamestown, regular worship became part of the life of the colony. Captain John Smith described the primitive conditions in which the settlers worshiped. Before they had a permanent church building, they gathered under a sail stretched among trees. Rough rails helped form their worship space, and they used an improvised altar. That image is worth holding in your mind. Before there was Washington National Cathedral, there was a sail between trees. Before there were beautiful Episcopal sanctuaries throughout the United States, there was an improvised altar at Jamestown. Before there was a presiding bishop, there was Robert Hunt. Before there was General Convention, there was a small colonial Christian community trying to pray together and survive. This tells us something important about the nature of the church. The church is not created by buildings. The church is not first an institution. The church is a worshiping community gathered around word and sacrament. The settlers had very little, but they had scripture. They had prayer. They had a priest. They had sacramental worship. And through those things, Anglican Christianity began to take root on American soil. The Book of Common Prayer became one of the central instruments of this transplantation. The prayer book shaped how Anglicans prayed, heard scripture, celebrated the sacraments, observed the Christian year, and understood their relationship with God and one another. The language, theology, and spirituality of the Church of England therefore crossed the Atlantic together with the settlers. The church in Virginia was not yet independent. It remained part of the Church of England. The colonists were English subjects. The English monarch was part of the political and ecclesiastical structure from which their church came. So the early Anglican Church in America was essentially the Church of England functioning in a colonial setting. This relationship between church and colony became very strong. In Virginia, religion was not considered merely a private matter. The Church of England became the established church. This meant that colonial law supported it. Church attendance could be required. Clergy were supported through taxation. The government expected religious conformity. The parish was therefore both an ecclesiastical and a public institution. By 1619, when the House of Burgesses began meeting in Virginia, the Anglican establishment was already becoming woven into colonial government. The parish system became especially important. Virginia was divided into parishes. Each parish normally had a church. When clergy were available, the parish had a minister. And each parish had a vestry composed of lay leaders who helped administer parish affairs. For you as a postulant, the vestry is especially important to notice. The vestry was not merely concerned with maintaining the church building. It handled finances. It participated in poor relief. It cared for orphans. It helped manage parish responsibilities. It sometimes participated in community discipline. In other words, the parish church became one of the primary institutions of colonial community life. This created an early American Anglican experience of shared responsibility between clergy and laity. That experience eventually helped shape the Episcopal Church. There was, however, a major problem. There were no Church of England bishops permanently residing in the American colonies. This is one of the most important facts to understand about colonial Anglicanism. The church was Episcopal by theology. It believed in bishops. But there were no bishops living in America. The colonial churches were generally connected ecclesiastically with the Bishop of London. If a man in Virginia believed that God was calling him to the priesthood, he ordinarily had to cross the Atlantic and travel to England to be ordained by a bishop. Imagine what that meant. There was no airplane. There was no quick journey. Crossing the Atlantic could take weeks. The journey was expensive. The journey was dangerous. Illness and shipwreck were real possibilities. This contributed to clergy shortages in the colonies. For someone in formation for ordained ministry today, this should give perspective. You are discerning priesthood in a church that now has dioceses, seminaries, commissions on ministry, bishops, standing committees, formation processes, canons, and clearly established structures. The early Anglican Church in America had none of this in the form we know today. A candidate for holy orders might literally need to cross an ocean to receive ordination. That historical difficulty eventually became one of the reasons American Anglicans would need their own bishops. But in the 17th century, the immediate concern was expansion. From Virginia, the Church of England spread into other colonies. Anglicanism became particularly strong in the South. It developed in Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. It also became legally established in Maryland after political changes there. Anglican congregations appeared in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. But Anglicanism did not dominate everywhere. New England had strong Puritan and congregational traditions. Pennsylvania was strongly influenced by Quakers. Presbyterians, Baptists, Dutch Reformed Christians, Catholics, Lutherans, and others increasingly contributed to the religious diversity of colonial America. This meant that the Church of England in America had to exist alongside other Christian traditions. That diversity eventually contributed to one of the great questions of American religious history. How should people with different religious convictions live together? The established Church of England did not always answer that question well. In some colonies, people who did not belong to the established church could still be taxed to support it. Dissenters sometimes experienced legal disadvantages. Later generations would challenge this arrangement. That struggle contributed to the eventual American commitment to religious liberty. This is an important lesson for the church. The Church of England contributed greatly to colonial society. But its established status also created problems. History teaches us that the church must be careful whenever religious authority becomes too dependent upon political privilege. The mission of the church should ultimately depend upon the gospel, not upon governmental power. The colonial church also existed within the complicated moral environment of colonization. English settlers did not arrive in an empty land. Native peoples already lived there. They possessed communities, governments, cultures, languages, spiritual traditions, and relationships with the land. The Virginia Company's plans included the conversion of indigenous peoples to Christianity. Anglican missionary efforts therefore existed alongside English colonial expansion. This history cannot be remembered only as a story of successful evangelization. Colonization also brought disease, warfare, displacement, and increasing pressure upon native lands. The Church's history must be honest enough to acknowledge both missionary intention and colonial injustice. The same honesty is required when speaking about slavery. As slavery expanded in the southern colonies, enslaved Africans became part of Anglican parish life. Some were baptized, some received Christian instruction, but baptism did not automatically bring freedom. The Church proclaimed Christian dignity, while many Anglicans participated in a society built increasingly upon racial slavery. This contradiction became part of the historical inheritance that the later Episcopal Church would have to confront. Why is this important for you as a postulant? Because church history is not hagiography. We do not study our tradition merely to praise everything our ancestors did. We study it to understand both faithfulness and failure. The Church can proclaim truth while its members fail to live according to that truth. That reality should produce humility in every generation of Christian leadership. By the 18th century, Anglicanism had become deeply connected with the leadership of colonial society. One familiar example is George Washington, who was part of Virginia's Anglican establishment and served as a vestryman. Many colonial political leaders had Anglican connections. But we must not conclude from this that America was founded as an Anglican nation. It was not. Anglicanism was one important religious tradition among several traditions that helped shape American society. The real importance of the founding of the Church of England on American soil is therefore deeper than simply saying that Anglicans arrived at Jamestown. Several things were happening at once. First, an ancient Christian tradition was being transplanted into a completely new environment. Second, the Book of Common Prayer was beginning to shape Christian worship in America. Third, parish and vestry life were creating patterns of lay responsibility. Fourth, the absence of bishops was creating questions about the future of episcopal ministry. Fifth, religious diversity was forcing Christians to think about conscience and religious freedom. Sixth, colonization and slavery were creating moral contradictions that the Church would inherit. And finally, the Church was beginning to change simply because America was different from England. This last point is particularly important. When the Church of England arrived in America, it came with English institutions. But distance changed things. There was no resident bishop. Lay leadership became stronger. Parishes exercised considerable local responsibility. Different colonies developed different forms of Anglican life. The seeds of an American Anglican identity were already growing before anyone intended to create an independent Episcopal Church. Then the American Revolution would change everything. The Church of England was tied institutionally to the British Crown. The monarch was supreme governor of the Church of England. The prayer book included prayers for the king. Clergy had responsibilities connected with the English establishment. Once the colonies declared independence, American Anglicans faced a crisis. How could they remain members of the Church of England when they were no longer citizens of England? That crisis eventually produced the Episcopal Church. But that later transformation makes sense only if we understand the foundation first. The church that became the Episcopal Church had already been living, worshiping, struggling, serving, and developing in America for more than a century and a half. The Episcopal Church, therefore, did not begin from nothing in 1789. It inherited a living Anglican tradition that had been present since Jamestown. The Episcopal Church inherited the prayer book. It inherited episcopal identity. It inherited priests and deacons. It inherited sacramental worship. It inherited parish life. It inherited vestries. It inherited missionary responsibility. It inherited both the achievements and the failures of colonial Anglicanism. This is why Jamestown matters. For Episcopal history, Jamestown represents more than the beginning of English settlement. It represents the planting of Anglican Christianity in American soil. And for you, Joe, as a postulant, there is a spiritual lesson here. Think again about Robert Hunt celebrating worship under primitive conditions. He did not know that more than 4 centuries later there would be Episcopal dioceses across the United States. He did not know there would be a Diocese of Texas. He did not know there would be a General Convention. He did not know there would be an American presiding bishop. He did not know that thousands of Episcopal congregations would eventually gather around word and sacrament. He simply exercised the ministry given to him in the place where he found himself. That is important for ordained ministry. We often do not know what God will eventually accomplish through ordinary acts of faithfulness. A priest prays. A priest preaches. A priest celebrates the Eucharist. A priest baptizes. A priest visits the sick. A priest teaches. A priest reconciles. A priest gathers people around Christ. The historical consequences may not be visible immediately, but ministry is planted one faithful act at a time. The early Church of England in America teaches another lesson. The church survives not because circumstances are easy. Jamestown was extraordinarily difficult. Settlers faced hunger, disease, conflict, isolation, and death. Yet worship continued. That pattern appears repeatedly throughout Christian history. The church is often most clearly revealed not when it is comfortable, but when it continues praying, serving, and celebrating the sacraments in difficult circumstances. For a postulant, therefore, the founding of the Church of England in America is not merely a date to memorize. 1607 is not simply information. It represents mission. It represents transplantation. It represents adaptation. It represents worship under uncertainty. It represents the beginnings of a church that would eventually become independent without abandoning its Anglican heritage. The permanent Church of England presence planted at Jamestown would eventually spread across the colonies. The American Revolution would later remove its political connection with England. Samuel Seabury would receive episcopal consecration from Scottish bishops in 1784. William White and Samuel Provost would receive consecration in England in 1787. And General Convention in 1789 would organize the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. The church that arrived in Jamestown was English. The church that emerged after the Revolution was American. But the historical, sacramental, liturgical, and episcopal continuity remained. That continuity is central to Episcopal identity. So, Joe, when you enter an Episcopal church today and hear the scriptures proclaimed, when you participate in the Eucharist, when you pray from the Book of Common Prayer, when you see the relationship among bishop, priest, deacon, and laity, you are participating in a tradition whose American roots extend back to those early Anglican communities. The surroundings have changed. The political system has changed. The nation has changed. The prayer book has developed. The church has learned, failed, repented, reformed, and grown. But the central calling remains. Gather the people, proclaim the word, celebrate the sacraments, serve the neighbor, seek reconciliation, and remain faithful to Christ. Perhaps this is the most important lesson from the founding of the Church of England on American soil. The church began here not with power, wealth, or magnificence, but with a community gathered in prayer. And for anyone preparing for ordained ministry, that is a fitting place to begin. Before administration comes prayer. Before leadership comes service. Before institution comes community. Before prestige comes faithfulness. And before there was the Episcopal Church in America, there were Christians under a sail at Jamestown, praying that God would remain with them in a new land. From that small beginning, an American Anglican tradition took root, and the history of that tradition eventually became our own.